Hello, this is Jeff Hanna. I am a Blair chiropractor, and I'm just going to be going through a little video here today on some of the annotations that we use, but also some of the annotations that ideally we would love to have as far as analysis. So I'm just going to walk through a couple of the pictures here, and truth be told, the one that I think we're all the very most interested in and that we need the best tools in order to work with is an X-ray that looks like this. It's called a base posterior, and there are certain features that we need to be able to identify right through this area here. Now, I do know that using VizTech, if you go through some of the different tools, and I know all of the different tools that are available here, but for example, there's the pre-programmed version where if you identify a whole bunch of points going back and forth like this, it's going to spit out a whole bunch of other calculations for what's needed with this kind of analysis. And so I know that it can be done. But we're just going to walk through what some of the different points here are. So firstly, what I'm going to use is I'm going to use the bone enhance and the contrast enhance to try to bring the points up here as high as possible. So we're going to zoom in, and oops, I'm going to try to zoom out. I'm doing this on a slightly different computer than I normally use, so things might be, yeah, things are being a little funny here. Yeah, we'll get it eventually. Okay, we'll start with this. There are a few points and a few things that I will show that we are trying to identify right here. This, if you can kind of make out a halo with the peg in the middle, that's what we're trying to see. The halo is looking top down on the first vertebra in the neck, and the peg that you see in the middle is where it sits on the second vertebra in the neck, and that's really what we're trying to identify. And there are a few points that we need to be able to identify in order to do the measurements, the analysis, and the annotations that we need to do as Blair chiropractors. So I'm going to use just the dot tool just to highlight these initial spots. The first one is what we call anterior point 1, and it's the interface on the inside of the atlas and basically the anterior, the front side here, where it intersects with the basically between the rim of the skull and with the C1 vertebra, and it's usually where you can see it slightly dark here. It's the biggest spot off to the side here and side here. So this one here we're going to call anterior point 1, and this is one of the first spots that we need to identify. Now, one of the things that would be great to have on this computer here, this dot actually looks pretty small, but on the main software on my proper X-ray computer that we use, the dot's actually a lot larger. And so if there was some kind of a way that this dot or the spot could actually be made smaller, so more like it's just a pinpoint size, large enough that you can actually see, but small enough that you can still see all of the surrounding structures, that would be a really, really good thing. Second point that we need to identify, so if this is anterior point 1 on in this case, this is the left side, this is the right side, we have to find a posterior point 1. And that is the intersection, again, between the skull, where it meets the most lateral aspect of the arch. It's approximately here on this person, and it's approximately here on this person. And so we have anterior point 1 and posterior point 1. And the other thing that we need to be able to correctly identify is what is called a lateral mass. Now, if the other members of the Blair Society have given you a picture of what an atlas looks like from the top down, what the lateral mass is it is a arced shape which comes around like this. So it makes a nice swooping arc as a general rule of thumb, but in some people it's kind of shaped more like this. Other people it's very steep, other people it's very shallow. It goes at any number of different angles, and we have to be able to identify it on the X-ray. Now some docs will use a tool where they can use the mouse and they can just sort of drag and hold it like this. Personally, what I do is I make just a bunch of dots along the margin like this to be able to identify where this lateral mass is, and then the same thing as it comes out here. Now, for programming purposes, I don't think you need to be able to identify, exactly where it's going to be, but just wanted to show you that this is a general rule of thumb in the way that, or the type of feature that we are actually looking for on the C1 vertebra. Now, the point of all of this, as you can see, is this makes these arcs on the left side and on the right side. But there are still these itty-bitty little gaps in between. And so if we were doing this on paper, or if we were doing this on an old x-ray, we would actually draw a straight line connecting all of these dots. Okay. Now, the final thing that we need to be able to identify, you might see these white things here. These are earplugs. They have a little bit of lead in them, which is what's making them show up as bright white on the x-ray. And it is a reference point that we use. So we have people, when we take the x-ray, we have them just put in these little earplugs here. And that is a reference point that we need to be able to identify versus the rest of the skull. And so these are the last points that we need to identify. So truth be told, this is all that we need to be able to find when it comes to looking at the x-rays. The remainder is about making the line constructions and the measurements so we can actually determine what an individual's unique bone structure is. So in no particular, well, I'll do this in a particular order. What we do first is we need to draw a line between anterior point 1 and posterior point 1 on the left and on the right. And so if these 2 points have already been identified, that's fantastic. It can just be determined as, calculated from that. Now the next point that we need to identify, and this is where the programming is definitely going to make a world of difference for us, is we need to be able to find the point that is 90 degrees perpendicular to anterior point 1, that is perpendicular to this line where it intersects with this outside region of the C1 lateral mass. And docs will do this a few different ways. I'm just going to click on a couple of buttons because I don't usually do it this way, so just bringing myself up to speed here. Okay. One of the ways that docs have done it is they'll click on anterior point 1 and they will click here. And then what they do is they take their tool and they're trying to approximate as close as they can to 90 degrees to wherever it's going to connect along this line. So I don't know if there's a tool that will create an algorithm that will show exactly where and how these basically can connect, so that if it connects right here, it can determine that automatically. I'm not exactly sure that. But this is where it gets rather finicky, because as you can see, okay, I'm at 88.6, 89.2, that's close, but we're trying to get as precise as we can. So, okay, 89.8, that's pretty good. 90.8, oh, so that's a little too much, and that's just with the slightest little bit of the movement. So this is about as close as I think I'm going to be able to get at 90.1, so I click it right there, and then it makes this, so I can put my annotation either on the inside or on the outside. I'm just going to put it like this on the outside just because it keeps it a little bit cleaner. So what we've created from this anterior point 1 right here is this it's the point where this perpendicular line intersects with the lateral mass, and we call this anterior point 2 or front point 2. What we need to do next is the exact same thing for posterior point 1 to identify posterior point 2. So same thing, let's draw a line like this, like that, and we're going to try to get it as close as we can to 90 degrees to the point that seems to intersect out this way. Okay, 90.1, again, I don't think I'm going to get much close. Okay, 89.7, we're pretty good right there, and then this is just to finish off the estimate here. Okay, now what you can probably see is we're trying to make a box. So we've constructed anterior point 1, we've identified anterior point 2 by drawing this line perpendicular to this line here between anterior 1 and posterior 1. And then we've just done posterior 1 to posterior 2. What we need to do next is determine what is the midpoint distance between this anterior line 1 and this posterior line 1. And so we can use the central point tool, but how handy would it be if it's already pre-calculated? And we click on the spot of anterior point 1, and then we click on the point of anterior point 2, and it makes this nice little X, so it's going to mark the spot for us. And then we do it on the back side, and so we have posterior point 1, and we took it out to posterior point 2, and same thing, it's created a lovely little X here. And now what we do is we need to create a line that goes through the midpoint of the front and the back lines that looks like this. And we generally like to extend it all the way going out through the skull. I'm not going to zoom out because we saw how finicky that was before, but you can imagine that this line is going out all the way between the skull right here. And it's not, oh, I gotta push it twice. I'll just take it out that far so I can be certain it's going to stick. So it should go a little bit farther than that, but that is the gist of it, and it's off there just a little bit, but for demonstration purposes this will do the trick. So this is what we've created, is what we're determining is if this is the shape of a person's atlas, we've basically created a line which represents and goes straight down the middle of the long axis. And so if there's any slipping of that joint, if we take an x-ray at this angle, we're going to be able to see it. It should be normal, but then we can see if it's slipped over, if it's slipped under, and that lets us know exactly where we need to direct our course of care. Now, I'm going to show, before I finish things up here, there is a secondary way that I've been doing these annotations, but it starts getting a little bit sloppier, or not sloppier, but it looks messy. And what I use has been the horizontal orthogonal angle tool, and what I will do is put a dot on anterior 1, and then what it does is it automatically creates this line that will be 90 degrees to it. And so I will just simply drag it out until posterior point 1 here. And the representation of anterior point 1 would be right there where this line is going to intersect at the margin that we outlined before. But as you see, this line is massive, sticking out so incredibly far, and it would be even worse if I actually turned it the other way. So I have to do it for here on the other side of the box. Let's say that we did it like that. Then suddenly what we're going to have is we're going to have a ton of lines all pointing in this direction towards the front of the skull. So you'll see in a moment that that would actually make it much, much worse. And so instead of doing it this way, I'm going to do it this way. So right there. So if there was a way to make it but where we can create a 90 degree angle from this point to this point and then simply push a click on the outside part, that would be great. But better yet if it could pre-calculate everything, because now what we need to do is we need to again do the intersection between these 2 points. So between we need to find the midway point between anterior 1 and the midway point between anterior 2. Now I can do it the exact same way as I did before using the center point rule, or I discovered this, it's a podiatry tool, it's called the intermetatarsal angle. This only works if I was to actually do and draw the convergence angle on each side, but I will do it so it's going to go over and it's going to overlap with this line right here, just to show you what it's actually doing and how it works. So we would click on anterior 1, click on anterior 2, we click on posterior 1, we click on posterior 2, and so you see it's not identical, but remember that very first line we did, I said it was actually a little bit off. Well, it turns out that I was probably going to be off by about 1 to 2 degrees. Sometimes that doesn't make any difference, and sometimes that makes all the difference, hence trying to be as precise as we possibly can. Then what I do is I need to annotate the other side, so anterior 1, anterior 2, posterior 1, and posterior 2. And so you can see what these lines do is it actually is already constructing the midpoint automatically. All I have to do is identify where is my anterior 1, anterior 2, posterior 1, posterior 2, and it creates this line. And again, the only reason I have to, even, do this is because I have to identify using that horizontal orthogonal angle or doing manually a 90-degree measurement like this. Point is we've got a couple of lines now which represent the long axis of the joint right here, which is represented by this angle, which again it's going way farther than we need it to, and represented by these two angles, which should be one, but for demonstration purposes, again, I showed a different way of doing it. Now, this is all well and good, having these measurements, but we need it in reference to something, and that's again why we had these two earplugs here. And so what we would normally do is we would draw a line that is horizontal from one side to the other like this. And then what we would do is we would draw another line that is exactly perpendicular to here. Now I can do that using the angle measurement tool. That's one way. Or I can use this horizontal orthogonal angle again. And so it would look something like this. So drawing it from here to here. But as you see, this is kicked way off to the side here. And so what I will typically do is I will grab the line and I will, actually let me fix that a little bit because I didn't want to grab it there. Okay. Oops. Yeah, there we go. If I grab it, I can pull it over, and I usually will put it at the exact intersection point between the two lines just because it makes it a little cleaner, a little easier to see. But then what happens is the line ends up going off the screen, and it's not a nice clean cut from the left ear to the right ear, which is what we like to see. So you can start to see how some of these lines off the side start getting, rather messy. Ultimately, what we need to know is we need to know the angle between this line here and the vertical component right here. So we're going to do the angle measurement. There's the center point. I'm going to take it right down the long axis. It could be to here. We could do it to here, but as long as it's along this line, again called the convergence angle, we're just measuring what that is. So that in reference to our line that is perpendicular to the earplug line, in this case 31 degrees, and that is the number that we need to determine. So what this means is that the left skull C1 joint is sitting at a 31.4 degree angle for this person. That is their individual normal bone structure, and that's the reference that we need to take into account in order to determine what's abnormal versus what's normal and determining what to adjust. We then need the exact opposite thing on the right side, 40.6. So if we make the assumption that we're supposed to be the same on both sides, we've got an error factor of 9 degrees there as far as determining what's happening next, and that is more than significant. The margin of error should be about 2 degrees less, even better. But yeah, 2 to 3 degrees. So if we were to just say, oh, we can guess at what these angles and these measurements are, we're going to be wrong a very, very significant percentage of the time. So this is the importance of the annotations on this X-ray. So let me zoom out just a little bit here. Well, we'll try to zoom out. There we go. Okay, I might have zoomed out a little too far. Let's zoom in. Yeah, too far. Okay, that'll actually be perfect. That's good right there. So I think you can see just how messy all of this starts to get. I could go in now and I can start to delete all of these different lines. So I could probably delete that line, or I could probably do this one at a time. I could delete this one annotation here if I wanted to. Now I could delete this one annotation here if I wanted to, but it still is, messier than we would ideally. Let's say I even was to delete that one. Because the point is when we analyze our normal Blair films, this is basically what it looks like right here. There is one additional line that we do also like to have, and that is a point that is, it's a little line that is perpendicular, or excuse me, it's parallel to the convergence angle, but it is exactly in line with the most lateral, the most outside portion of that outline of the lateral mass. And so if I wanted to create that, I would have to firstly, and I'm just doing this arbitrary, I'm eyeballing it here, as I'm creating a line that is parallel to that convergence angle that we measured. It's about there. There we go. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to, and so here's where it gets tricky, is okay, we want it most lateral, yeah, right about there, and then extend it out this way. Now you can see how suddenly now I have to start guessing, okay, well, is it here, is it here, you know, trying to keep it as parallel as I can. Let's say it's right there. Now the tricky part is, okay, now I need to grab it on the other side and try and pull it up this way because I don't want it obstructing the rest of my view. The point of having this little line here is this represents the ideal entry point and the ideal feature that we're looking on a person's face when we're going to be taking the x-ray. So in this case, we would look for, okay, this is going to correspond with the outside aspect of this person's eye socket and kind of going down through the middle part of their cheek through this sinus cavity right here. Now, we should probably do the same thing on the other side. So again, let's be very finicky. What I'm going to do in this case, shoot, I did that wrong. Yeah. Again, this is not my normal computer, but we'll get there. Okay, this will work. So, okay, I know what I'm doing wrong. I need to have the tool. So what I'm going to do actually this time is I'm going to draw a super duper long line that basically is a bit overkill, but what this one's going to let me do, that one seems to be about perpendicular. Right there. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to drag it so that it overlaps with that most lateral aspect here. So it's going to correspond with the edge. Now I'm going to drag it up so that it's just intersecting. And now again, I'm trying to eyeball it approximately here. That looks about parallel. So you can see here that this line is not the same as this line. And again, this corresponds with what we saw before when we actually measured these convergence angles. Well, this makes sense. This one was 31 degrees, so it's shallower. This one is almost 41 degrees, so it would make sense that in order to see that structure, we need to have an entry point for our x-ray at a different point and a different feature of the patient's skull. I think that about covers the Blair analysis for the base posterior. I'm sure if I've forgotten or made any errors here, that one of the other board members will be able to correct me on this. But it would be lovely again to just be able to identify these few structures, because again, if we're able to identify anterior point 1, posterior point 1 on the left side and then on the right side, if we're able to identify an outline where it makes a nice arc representing the lateral mass, and then to be able to just dot on the two earplug references, and boom, all of these calculations come out automatically, that would save us all an inordinate amount of time. Just to show you what also happens ultimately, so we use this x-ray and then we also do a simple measurement on this one. This one, it does vary a little bit, but we basically use the normal angle measurement tool with respect to gravity. And so we would take an x-ray at this angle, and then with which is usually about 10 to 15 degrees, so that's pretty average, but we would take the next x-rays at this 31 and at this 40 degrees, and we would come up with an x-ray that looks like this. and so I'm just going to zoom in so you can see the importance of it, is when you take a person's own bone structure into account, you can see a very sharp and very clear joint right through here. And this spot should line up exactly with this spot. So again, it's handy. Right here's another case where the two dots are a little bit larger than we would ideally like. But still that works. And what we end up doing is we end up having to measure, okay, what is this joint angle using the, usually it's the horizontal angle. So we do that on both sides here. And then we do that on the opposite picture, which would be right here. Now this is a case of a person that I took. Both of this person's is extremely sharp, very easy to see joint margins. And I think you can see on both sides, this is a textbook normal because there is no overlap and there is no underlap of these joints. But this is the importance of having all of the angles right on this, this tool and on this x-ray right here. So I hope that that covers it. Certainly if you have any questions, you can contact the the other board members here. Otherwise, if there's anything that I've said that maybe quite didn't make sense, or you want to elaborate on that, you can get a hold of me. My personal email is jeshannah.dc@gmail.com. You can also get me at it's Atlas Health Australia @gmail.com. Alternatively, you can feel free to call me, but as you might have gathered from the Australia one there, I'm actually calling you from or writing this from a little bit farther away. But you can also call me directly by dialing the out-of-country code. For Australia, it is 61, and then my number directly is 400-842-711. Okay, I hope that's about covered it. And thank you very much for the work that you're doing, and good luck.